Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're joined by Lloyd Evans. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and we talk about his experience leaving the religion, his thoughts on religion in general, as well as a slew of other topics. He's one of the first people I've come across when I first started getting interested in the topic of religion and atheism, so it's a bit strange to have him on and actually talk with him. He's an all-around great guy, and I hope he continues to fight the good fight. I should also mention that starting the next video, the audio will be much better as I now have the proper equipment. So if you've been a fan since the beginning, I thank you for sticking around. Anyways, on to the show. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always a pleasure.
We're joined by a special guest. If you are among the circles that I am, the circles of cosmic skeptic, genetically modified skeptic, then you damn well very know who this person is. This is Lloyd Evans. Lloyd, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for that extremely flattering introduction. I'm not sure I'm quite in the Cosmic Skeptic, GM Skeptic League, but I certainly do my best in my little sphere of YouTube.
Oh, well, at the risk of inflating your ego, I'll go ahead and place you in that camp, because in fact, that's how I found out about you, through Cosmic Skeptic. So it's great to finally have you on. It's so weird having these podcast conversations with people that for the longest time I'd watched their content on YouTube, and now all of a sudden they're on the opposite side of the screen of me, actually having the conversation, returning the conversation back to me. So yeah, it's great to have you here. How are you holding up during the pandemic?
Well, Croatia's done very well, actually. I was looking at a graphic that was circulating on Twitter the other day showing the curves for all different countries, and they had 3 countries with a red curve because it isn't actually a curve, it just keeps going up. Those countries were the United States, the UK, and Sweden. Mine was one of a number of countries, Croatia, where I live, where it is a proper curve, and we're now at a point where there's almost no one dying or infected with COVID-19. So restrictions are starting to be lifted here in Croatia, but it's a small country, not very densely populated. So it's been much easier to practice social distancing.
Has there been like a curfew implemented in Croatia? Because over here, for instance, there's a 10 p.m. curfew.
I'm not so sure that I wasn't following things as closely as my wife was, and I don't tend to go out. I'm one of these boring married blokes, I'm afraid. So there could be any kind of curfew in place, and it would kind of be irrelevant to me. Maybe there was. I know there was a raft of restrictions in place. There still are restrictions in that I couldn't, for example, drive to the capital Zagreb, even though it's only an hour away, because we're still not allowed to cross from one county to another. So it's kind of, I have felt a pinch with the restrictions, but, you know, I'm happy to have them in place if it's going to save lives, you know? Yeah,
I 100% agree that if this quarantine has done anything for me, it's increased my alcohol intake. So I don't know how well my liver's holding up. But it's interesting. The United States is definitely one of those strange countries that is reacting, interestingly enough, I guess, to the situation where we recently had a whole outcry in Michigan where people are protesting, stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the people protesting and wanting their economic freedom back, sort of sympathize?
Oh, it's silly. It's silly. And it's interesting that kind of Sweden is one of the countries that bucked the trend, and you wonder why, because you think of all of the Scandinavian countries really as being fairly liberal and fairly, you know, common sense approach to things. But no, I don't think anyone has a right to infect people with a deadly pathogen that turns people's lungs to soup. You know. And I find it ironic that some of the signs were saying things like my body, my choice. Apparently that logic is allowed when we're talking about spreading deadly pathogens, but you're not allowed to use that logic in terms of abortion, apparently. So, yeah, there we go.
I think we're going to get into some of that logic or lack of it later on today, Lloyd. But that
Yeah.
is a very, very interesting counterpoint that we're seeing uh, from from mostly right wing circles.
Mm.
Mhm.
Uh, it's intriguing.
What's that one phrase? Your ability to swing your fist ends at my nose or something like that. Help me out here, Bruce. How does it go?
Your freedom to swing
Your
your
freedom to
fist.
swing
Yeah.
to swing your fist, to move your arms around, it ends exactly 2 inches in front of my nose because my consequences of actions that could affect you and the people around us.
Hmm.
So those actions have to be chosen very, very carefully.
And that's why it's so selfish when you see these protests. They're protesting their freedoms. It's all about them. It's not about the people who will be infected, irrespective of what happens to them. And the reason why COVID-19 has proved to be so deadly is because it doesn't kill everyone. And because you can have it and not have any symptoms. You can be an asymptomatic carrier and thus a vector for the pathogen. That's how it's been successful. If it completely laid waste to everyone it touched, it would be so much easier to isolate it. You know, we'd just follow the death and we'd put up a big fence around where all the death was and we'd stop it in its tracks. But this is a pathogen that's able to skip continents because people can carry it and no one can know about it. So this whole idea of, oh, it's my choice, it's my risk. It isn't your risk, it's everyone's risk. One person catching it is potentially hundreds or thousands of people catching it. And that's what I don't think they understand. And then you throw in all of the conspiracy stuff and, you know, people like David Icke saying, oh, it's all connected with the Illuminati and the lizard men. That's when it gets really ugly, you know?
It's so annoying that this pathogen really came out at a prime time. This whole idea of this I don't want to say the actual thing because apparently YouTube has an algorithm where if you say the name of the pathogen, it'll completely.
Oh, we're past that now, I'm afraid. You can say it. I have videos monetized where I'm saying it, but what you'll have to do is because they now, you know, don't get me started on YouTube's demonetization policy, but they now have something called self-certification, which isn't really self-certification because they go ahead and make their own decision anyway. But they ask you to check some boxes, and one of the boxes you can check is talking about current affairs, including COVID-19, and it actually says when you tick that box, oh, this is fine to talk about. So they have lessened their censorship of this pathogen. Otherwise, I would have spoken about it in far more ambiguous terms.
Oh, all right. Well, that's fantastic. I haven't noticed
Yeah.
that. But it's so annoying how this thing is basically just ripe for conspiracy theories, where it
Mm.
launched around the same time that the whole 5G thing launched. Now we have that conspiracy, and we have people like what's his name, Rush Limbaugh, making the claim that that there was a COVID 1 through 18, and there just so obviously wasn't. But he has
Oh,
millions of people to him, so we have that problem now.
oh my God.
So it's just completely ripe for misinformation, completely ripe for conspiracy theories, and people are going so far as to say, "Ha, you see, the UCSF panel of experts and Mark L, the epidemiologist at Harvard, all claimed that there could have been millions of deaths, but now we're looking at maybe around 70,000." Well, yeah, that's because we took precautionary measures, and the whole idea of millions of deaths would have been if we did nothing. So it's that paradox that you're always going to see where everything that we're doing, everything that we're enforcing is working. And so the curve is flattening. And because the curve is flattening, the naysayers are going to say, hi, you see, we overreacted. It's like, well, it's a no-win scenario.
Oh, definitely. Look, there's no way that the conspiracy nuts are ever going to be silenced on this, because they operate outside the realm of, you know, evidence anyway, don't they? So you can show them any amount of evidence and they'll still come up with a counter argument. It's like religion, isn't it? It's the same thing there.
It's the endless apologism. I'm pretty sure later on, if they ever realize they've been proven wrong, they'll come back and say, "Oh, I was just being sarcastic." Like our interesting president has said before in his interviews. It's ridiculous in itself.
Well, that's how they deal with their cognitive dissonance. It's to just put their hands over their ears usually and shout la la la, I can't hear you. And the way that your president does that currently is to just say fake news and oh okay, meaning I'm not listening to this and no one else should listen to it either. But again, don't get me started on him. But what a weird world we're living in. I mean, I sometimes think back, because there's been no shortage of political upheaval in the UK either, as I'm sure you're aware. And I sometimes think back to sort of 2014, 2015 and think, where did it all go wrong? I mean, I had political opinions back then, but none of them were along the lines of, oh my God, we're all going to die. Potentially, with some of the decisions. I mean, you just think, well, bad political decisions are just going to make things a little bit worse and take it longer for progress to be made. But nowadays, all of that's gone out the window, and we just seem to be living in this alternate reality where all of the worst possible decisions are being made. And it's just a case of how many bad decisions can civilization and our planet take before it becomes irreversible. And I know there's a strong argument that it's already irreversible, of course, but yeah, it doesn't bear thinking about.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we need to be concerned about. I've always said that if we want to survive the next 200 years, there's some existential risks that we can't afford to not waste, to not spend time on them. And one of them is climate change, which unfortunately has become so politicized that you can't even have an honest conversation with the opposition on this one. And the other one, interestingly enough, is the topic of religion, which is what our main focus is going to be on this podcast. So I think you do absolutely important work in highlighting the Jehovah's Witness religion, because it's so easy to just ignore this religion as big of a threat as it actually is, and immediately point to other religions such as Scientology or Mormonism as, oh, look how crazy these religions are, and all that stuff. But Jehovah's Witness really goes under the radar in this respect. And it wasn't until that I started seeing your work. I had a babysitter when I was a kid that was Jehovah's Witness, and it wasn't until that I started seeing your work that I started to recognize the patterns in her and go, wait a minute, she was trying to proselytize me the whole time. I mean, I was just a kid. There was no way I was going to understand the nuances of her arguments, but she was literally trying to turn me away from Catholicism, which was the religion that I was raised, into the Jehovah's Witness thing. So is that a common thing, having Jehovah's Witness trying to proselytize people?
Oh yeah, everyone is fair game when it comes to proselytizing. I mean, obviously they're going to be very sneaky about it when it comes to their work, when it comes to their employment, because they're not going to want to get sacked. So she knows that if she were to be too overt with her attempts, then sooner or later it's going to filter back to your parents, and there's going to be big consequences. So she'll have been doing it very, very sneakily. But no, that's the MO of every Jehovah's Witness. They even say to children, and this is the thing that really irritates me, because I think that children should be allowed to be children, and I think that school is for learning. But they even send children to school and tell them, this is your personal territory. So no one else in the congregation can get into your classroom apart from you. That makes it your personal territory. That means that you need to take any and all opportunities to witness, that's what they call it, witnessing, to your classmates or to your teacher. So you even have videos showing young witnesses at, say, high school getting in front of the class and explaining to their classmates that evolution is a lie. So that's the sort of thing that witnesses are supposed to do.
Yeah, so for the sake of familiarizing my audience with your work, just in case they have no idea, would you mind giving a quick synopsis, as brief as you'd like it, about why it is that you make videos exposing the Watchtower and the Jehovah's Witness belief system?
Because it's an abusive cult, and there are 8.5 million people currently caught up in it. And when I left the group, I started to wake up from the indoctrination at the beginning of 2010, did a whole lot of research, and found that I drew catharsis from explaining to other people, where there were various scandals and false teachings and that kind of thing. So one thing led to another. I started doing a blog, then I started doing YouTube videos, and my YouTube channel just happened to coincide with the Jehovah's Witness leadership making a decision to put their focus on making propaganda videos. So I started my channel in 2012 and started vlogging towards the end of 2013, and then in 2014 the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses launched a program called JW Broadcasting. So every month, usually, they will put out an hour-long kind of propaganda marathon where they show extremely coercive, manipulative material. So one of the things I do on my channel every month is do a rebuttal to that. I also obviously speak about more broadly about Jehovah's Witness theology and history, and any other bits of propaganda that leak out of the organization.
And what's interesting is that you didn't just leave Jehovah's Witness, but you left religion altogether. Why didn't you leave? We know, for instance, Leah Remini, when she left Scientology, she still stayed within the domain of religion. She still considers herself, I think she's a Christian now or something, or she does believe in God.
She's a Catholic.
Oh,
she's on your team.
Oh yeah, well, my family's team at least.
Yeah.
But why didn't you leave religion altogether?
Look, I try and emphasize as strongly as possible that it's for everyone to decide what journey they take, because it's actually quite personal for me, because the Jehovah's Witness leadership creates this stereotype of what an apostate is, what they say, and even what they look like. And among the things that they're supposed to do is try to draw people off after themselves and try to give people a whole new identity, almost a whole new set of beliefs. And my attitude is, it's not for me to tell you what the next stage in your journey is. I only need to tell you that you have escaped or are in the process of escaping, because you're watching my channel, an abusive and corrupt organization. What you do next is your business. But just because I have embraced agnostic atheism, that doesn't mean I insist that everyone who watches my channel must do the same thing. Everyone gets to decide. I'm not going to censor myself about my atheism, and I do sometimes make atheist videos, but for the most part I try to make it a safe landing place for people who are in the process of waking up from Jehovah's Witnesses, so they don't feel as though they're being preached to. They don't feel as though they're being kind of hooked into a whole new belief system. They're instead just simply being given the information they need and being given the freedom to make their own decisions.
That's completely commendable. The first step has to be try to escape this corrupt cult, as you like to call it. And then the second step is, okay, from there on, decide what your path is going to be. Completely commendable. And what I've always wondered is, ever since you left religion, how is this, or ever since you left Jehovah's Witness specifically, how has your happiness has been affected? Because, you lost relationships, but at the same time, you gained a completely new outlook on life, where you can look at topics such as morality, politics, free will, completely isolated from religion.
Yeah, happiness is a tricky one. I've tried to grapple that subject in a video. How have I changed since I was a Jehovah's Witness is one of the videos. And I talk about happiness because, how can I describe it? I'm a completely different person, and I'm far more grounded in reality. I look back on the Jehovah's Witness Lloyd, and he was just living in like a false construct. It's very much like, being in the Matrix, your entire perception of reality and what life is for is based on a lie. And so now I'm decluttered from all of that, And again, I've got some decisions to make as to what I believe or don't believe. I have the freedom to exercise critical thinking, and that freedom is beautiful. One of the slogans I try and use whenever I'm speaking with fellow ex-witnesses is freedom is our paradise. You know, when we were witnesses, we were chasing this idea of a paradise with pandas and lions roaming around, and massive watermelon on the picnic table and bananas. And this was our idea of paradise. We didn't really stop to think about the fact that buried under the lawn would be the bodies of 7.5 billion people who've been killed for not being Jehovah's Witnesses when Armageddon comes. We don't tend to think about that. But for me, paradise is all about having the freedom to think for yourself. And that happiness, that satisfaction and contentment, I wouldn't trade for anything. That doesn't mean that I am entirely happy all the time. In some ways, I can struggle more with depression because there's no kind of artificial construct. And that's not to say Jehovah's Witnesses don't suffer with depression, by the way, because a lot of them do. But there's no kind of artificial kind of pick-me-up that you can just lean on. You know, your problems are for you to deal with, and you don't get to outsource them anymore to some sky daddy who's going to fix everything for you. And that can be quite a harsh reality to adapt to. And in some ways, I'm still adapting to it. But I wouldn't trade my mental freedom for anything. I'll take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah, that's one of the topics of conversation that I always find the most interesting, is that how do people's outlook completely change? I know for a fact that when I left for religion, for instance, I actually became so much happier because I wasn't boggled down by these moral dilemmas where I just, where, you know, one of the things that always concerned me was the fact that in Catholicism, you're taught to love God more than your family, and I just couldn't do that. And so when I completely left religion altogether, I recognized the fact that this is the only life we most likely have. So I started spending more time with my family. I started enjoying the small things more, and the level of my happiness has increased. And so even though I wasn't a part of the Jehovah's Witness mentality, it's still interesting for me to sort of get a grasp of how it is that people think these sort of things are. But do you think, you know, when you were in the Jehovah, because you were an elder, right, in Jehovah's Witness?
Yeah.
Yeah. When you were in the Jehovah's Witness religion as an elder, you thought that the religion itself was benign. Do you think there are some religions out there that are benign in the same sense that you thought Jehovah's Witness was?
Well, I think that my opinions as a Jehovah's Witness elder were quite frankly irrelevant because my whole assumption was, you know, there's only one religion that's true, and by golly, I just happen to have been born into it. You know, what are the chances of that happening? And, you know, that's not, I'm not really interested in that sort of opinion. But if your question is, do you think that it's possible to have a benign religion? What I say is that all religions to some degree are cults. And some people don't like me saying that, but let me just explain it. I think that you can have soft cults, and I think you can have extreme cults. So at the very most extreme end of cults, I would point to ISIS, for example. That's basically the most extreme that you get as a cult. And somewhere in the middle ground, you have groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientology. Moving more towards the soft end of the spectrum, you might have Anglicanism and the Roman Catholicism. But if you're going to ask me, okay, well, you're saying all religions are soft cults, what would be the softest form of a cult? Well, you could have, as far as I can imagine, you could have a religion that says God is real and he insists that you all only do nice things to each other, and that's the only teaching, that's the only thing we're going to teach you. And so you could have a group of people as a religion who believe that and embrace that, and so they do only nice things to each other. but they're still at a disadvantage when it comes to, society in general, because they're having to indoctrinate all of their children with this idea God is real that doesn't have any evidence. So even if you could imagine the most benign form of religion, it would still be a detriment to people, to at least some degree, because it would be passing on dogma. In other words, you can't have a religion without dogma, and dogma is essentially a set of beliefs that can't be proven. And I think that you're always at a disadvantage if you're, number one, believing things that can't be proven, and number two, passing those things on to children. So that's why I think all religions are cults, but I'm not kept awake at night by all religions in the same way as I'm kept awake by the more damaging and extreme religions that really do inflict misery on people on an unfathomable scale.
Lloyd, we had on a guest recently by the name of Jay Shapiro. He was the brains behind Islam and the Future of Tolerance. When we were speaking, he brought up somewhere in the conversation we brought up the idea of is there value in religion? And I'm an ex-Lutheran, more or less myself. And I'm of the belief that, despite being an atheist, that religions themselves provides, for better or worse, frameworks, rituals, and structure from which to scaffold our lives. Now, devoid of the superstition, it really appears to play a very, very important role for granting people a certain structure from which to mark certain rituals, certain stages of their life's journey. And in Sasha Sagan's book, she talks about the necessity of this, but where certain celebrations, certain events came from a naturalistic context, given the superstitious one. What's your take on this coming through Jehovah's Witnesses? Like, do you still see religion as playing this kind of role in our lives? Like, can the rituals, can the scaffolding, can the structural aspects be taken into a 21st century context? I argue that I think it's necessary, but
yeah, that's a very, very good point. And by the way, I've watched the film that you're alluding to, and I'm a massive admirer of the film and the book. I think that it's a very important conversation that Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz have had, and more people need to listen to that conversation. Look, everyone's different, and I'm not one of these atheists who says we need to be thinking seriously about completely annihilating religion off the face of the planet, because I don't think that, number one, that's a practical goal to have. And I also just instinctively, and from speaking to people and interacting with people, including many fellow ex-witnesses who don't turn to atheism, I've kind of happened upon this conclusion that for some people, they seem to need religion in their lives, in whatever manifestation it takes. They seem to be so minded that their lives only have, like you say, a workable framework when there is some kind of theology underpinning it all. So I think it's unrealistic to try and strive for a target of zero religion. I think that there will always be religion. I think that the problem that we have, and the reason for much of the controversy between religious people and atheists, is the amount of harm that religion is doing that is going completely unchecked by society. I mean, in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, you have an organization that's encouraging people to die rather than accept blood transfusions. You have an organization that's covering up child abuse on an industrial scale. And you have an organization that's breaking apart families through shunning. And yet, in my country of birth, the United Kingdom, the legal entities of Jehovah's Witnesses are awarded charitable status. You can imagine what a slap in the face that is for me, that this instrument of misery for me in my personal life is looked upon in my country, by my country, as a charity, which almost, or not just almost, does in fact make the government complicit to at least some degree in the misery I'm experiencing on a daily basis. So I think that the problem that we have is not so much whether individuals should be religious or not. It's a question of what place does religion have in society. And I think it is realistic, and it is noble to be aiming for a situation where religion is kind of in its place. It doesn't have its tentacles in government. It doesn't have its tentacles in power. And when it does things that are abusive and impinge on people's human rights, it is held to account. And we are a million miles away from that being the case at the moment.
You know,
religious...
Oh yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Religion does seem to have a privileged place in our society, and like one of our previous guests, Yasmin Mohammed, has spoken many times about her frustrations in having to inform people about Islamic fundamentalism, and Vincent and I have been in circles in which we've heard and spoken to several people from the liberal and ex-Muslim community, and how several of them are just absolutely appalled that Islamophobia has become a thing, and they won't distinguish between that and anti-Muslim bigotry, and it's been a real interesting thing to see about how apostates from those communities really take it as a slap in the face, saying like, this is a religion, this is something that's sacred, when it does a great amount of harm in the world. And I just couldn't help but see the parallels in your case here. Now, granted, Jehovah's Witnesses is a much smaller case than something like Islam, but the parallels are certainly there.
Well, I think, and I'm familiar with Yasmin. I've had her on my channel a couple of times, and massive admirer of what she's done, of her work. And yes, it's almost like being re-victimized when you scramble your way out of an abusive group, against the odds, by the way, because, you know, nearly everyone you know is still inside, still drinking the Kool-Aid. And through a sheer twist of fate, you happen to have managed to wake up to, again, to use the Matrix analogy, to the fact that none of it is real, that you're in some kind of construct and you need to escape. So to summon the courage and the bravery and the intellectual honesty to completely recalibrate your life to the extent of going through unfathomable heartache by relationships being severed and all that kind of thing, to encounter this sort of indifference by society in general, where people are telling you, in Yasmin's case, oh, you don't even get to criticize this group that you've escaped from because that's Islamophobia. It's like you're being victimized all over again. And it's a similar thing that I was describing to you about the way Jehovah's Witnesses are given charitable status, and people tend to turn a blind eye to, you know, clear evidence that they're an abusive group. Again, you look to civilization and you think, surely they're going to come riding to the rescue. And when you find out no one's riding to the rescue, and you find out that actually you are completely alone, I say you, I mean you and all of your fellow apostates, that produces almost a second wave of anger, because you've been victimized by the group, and to a degree you're being re-victimized by the indifference and in some cases hostility of society in general to your apostasy.
Right.
I want to touch on something that you said about the fact that some people need religion and religion probably won't go away. I was listening to an interview that Alex O'Connor, a cosmic skeptic, had on trigonometry, and they asked him this question: how do you feel about the people that lose religion, and they go on saying that they feel like they're losing something in their life, that they're missing something, that they need some spiritual guidance. And I think he said something that really convinced me onto his side. And he said something along the lines of, well, yeah, when you're raised into a religion and you're told for all your life that this is where you're going to get your meaning from, this is where you're going to get your spiritual guidance from, then of course it's going to feel like you're missing something. And so that's the way I view the argument whenever someone says that sometimes people need religion. Well, I mean, they're told. I can understand the argument from a third world perspective. From a first world perspective, and coming from a country that is the United States, is the only country left in the world that is the only first world country left in the world that is predominantly religious, I can sort of understand and agree with Alex's arguments.
So just to clarify, when I say that some people need it, I don't mean they really do need it. I mean that what's a better way of describing it? They can't be they will not be persuaded that they don't need it, is probably a more accurate way of putting it. So my approach, and the approach of I think nearly all atheists and atheist YouTubers, is or should be to put atheism in the shop window, where it's been absent for centuries. Only in the last 100 years or so have you been able to talk freely about atheism and do so without risking for your life. But certainly in the information age, it's possible to not have to worry about threats to your well-being, or at least in most Western countries that's the case. My position is, let's put it in the shop window, but I'm telling you, lots of people won't want to buy it, and they won't be persuaded otherwise. That doesn't mean that that it's impossible for them to live without religion. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm saying good luck trying to persuade them, because I've had so many conversations with people who are religious, and I can see that it doesn't matter. I think Sam Harris has said, how do you convince someone to value evidence when they don't value evidence, or words along those lines? You're just going to come up against a brick wall, and I'm more into accepting the reality of that than perhaps some atheists will be.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And on to the points of you saying that you don't think religion is ever going to die, the statistics that I've been looking at show an exponential increase in the nuns. So I've always wondered if maybe religion the Abrahamic religion specifically, I suppose, will get to the same point at which Norse mythology is, Greek mythology is right now, where it's not completely eradicated. There are still some people that believe in those religions, but it's so minuscule to the point where we don't have to be concerned about it. Do you think at least religion will hit that level?
I mean, who knows? I can imagine. I mean, I've explained about trying to kind of force religion into its corner in terms of the way it's dealt with by society and the privileged position it enjoys at the moment. Whether we'll also see something like that in terms of the number of adherents, look, who knows? I suppose nature abhors a vacuum. So if it does get to the point where the Abrahamic religions get to like a negligible amount of following, who's to say that there won't be some other non-Abrahamic religions? I mean, Scientology isn't an Abrahamic religion, albeit it's absolutely minuscule. But who's to say that there won't be something else that pops up that we're completely unaware of? If there's one thing about religion, if you look at the history of religion, it's that there's no shortage of would-be founders of religions. So there's always someone who's ready to step up and say, hey, I've figured it out. This is what you all need to follow. So who knows? I like to think that secularism will win the day in terms of, and humanism will win the day in terms of being the kind of go-to model of thinking, but there are no guarantees.
Lloyd, speaking of religion and most especially atheism, right? Within recent years, there's been an incredible division inside the atheist movement. We were going on a little bit about politics at the beginning of this podcast. With the movement splintering between because of the political polarization we see the atheist movement just taking different directions because of what's going on with SJWs and the current state of politics in the United States and around the world right now. It seems to be doing a lot of damage to the movement. What do you see the future of this movement becoming, and how do you fit into it all?
That's a tricky one. I try to kind of just be a very distant spectator when it comes to the controversies in the realm of the atheist quote unquote community, because I've been through, it will be 10 years next year. I've been through 10 years of ex-Jehovah's Witness activism, and there's equal controversy and equal infighting in the ex-Jehovah's Witness movement. And all I can put it down to is the larger a community becomes, the more fractious it's going to be, because it's going to have more people in it, and those people are not necessarily all going to see things the same way. So one way of looking at it is, and I think I've spoken to Hemant Mehta about this, and I think we're in agreement, or I think this is how he thinks, but look, the infighting is a sign that the movement's in a way doing well, because if everyone was on the same page, then that would mean it would be a tiny movement. You know, the reason why there is so much polarization and so much infighting is because the movement has grown to such a gargantuan level that there can now be movements within the movement, and there can be friction and there can be controversy. And I think that's to a large extent what we're seeing. We certainly see it in the ex-Jehovah's Witness movement. It used to be that if you were an ex-Jehovah's Witness, you were almost always going to be some form of Christian or born-again Christian. If you read nearly all the early ex-Jehovah's Witness books written by former members, I'm going to say all of them were written from the perspective of, yes, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't true, but you can still, and you should still be a Christian. And now, of course, that's not the way the movement is. I would say probably half of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, if not slightly more, are atheist or non-believers. And, you know, my book is obviously not advocating for religion. If anything, it's advocating for atheism. But it's just an inevitability, really, of time and of the movement increasing, that you're going to see controversies and infighting.
Okay.
Huh. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I never thought of it that way. That maybe infighting is a sign that the movement is being successful because there's so many people in the movement. I might have to marinate on that. That's
not to say the infighting is necessarily good, because what it can also do, if there's too much infighting, is that people that you're trying to reach through to will say, well, why would I want to join your movement? Because look how fractious you are. Our movement is all harmonious, and we're all on the same page. And it's difficult to explain to people in that situation, well, there's a reason why there's so much unity, and there's a reason why you're all on the same page. It's because you're in a cult. So it can also be a harder sell, having so much controversy and so much infighting, but you just have to leave it to people to figure things out for themselves for the most part, and they will naturally gravitate, you would think, to the part of the movement that speaks to them.
Yeah, I think disagreement is perfectly fine so long as there's no vitriol or mudslinging within the conversation. So, but going back to the conversation surrounding Jehovah's Witness broadcasting, this is one of the most fascinating things that I've seen about the Jehovah's Witness religion, because I've seen you go on these hour-long videos with you alongside Hassan and talk about these sort of things, and it's so fascinating. Especially how are they handling the pandemic? They're sort of viewing it in an eschatological way. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, that was so we had Stephen Hassan, who's kind of one of the preeminent cult experts, on my channel, along with the rest of my panel, to discuss the Jehovah's Witness response to COVID-19. And it's been very interesting because the earliest reaction that you got on camera. Of course, this is all unprecedented, not just in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of the capacity for the organization to react on camera, because for decades and decades they didn't have like a Hollywood wing to the organization. Everything was done in print. But now when the leaders react, they can do so on camera, and they're not, how can I put this? They're not exercising the prudence that might be advantageous, given the fact that once you say something on camera in HD, the internet remembers. And so what you had in the early days was Stephen Lett, who's a governing body member, saying that the events that we're seeing are unquestionably proof that we are living in the last days of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the last days, or something along those lines. I have the clip on my channel. But you also had another governing body member, Tony Morris, saying, well, where's the shock? I'm not shocked by this. Doesn't bother me. Meaning, well, this is these pandemics and these stories of pestilence are what we're supposed to expect from an apocalyptic point of view. And as I said at the time, these statements are not going to age well. You know, once this pandemic's been and gone, and there has been no Armageddon, people like me get to play those videos again and again and again to show people the scaremongering doomsday side of the organization, and which is precisely the point we've been making all along. But what they've done more recently is they issued a video saying, well, it might also be just a point in history. We'll have to wait and see. So they're already kind of, just, maybe we misspoke a little bit there. Maybe we should just do a little bit of damage limitation, just in case this is just another event in history. So that's pretty much how they've reacted. But I must say, in terms of taking measures to protect believers, I've been mostly quite relieved, because they have, for example, told witnesses that they can have their meetings over Zoom rather than going to their place of worship. And when you look at the kind of evangelical right-wing Christianity, stories coming out of America, that's not what some fundamentalist Christians have been saying. So considering the nature of the religion and how seriously they take things, I'm actually quite relieved. I think they could have made things worse, potentially.
Yeah, I was just about to mention about how horrifying some of the right-wing evangelical groups could be. But you worked alongside Leah Remini, who escaped Scientology. And one of the big similarities that I noticed is the whole concept of shunning, where if any of your family members leave Scientology, you're not allowed to have a conversation with them. You're basically supposed to completely cut ties. And there's a similarity there with Jehovah's Witnesses. But are there any other similarities that you've noticed besides the idea of shunning?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses are in completely different universes when it comes to their theology and their teachings. Well, again, Scientology doesn't really have a theology. It's really just an attempt at replacing mental health, psychology and that kind of thing, using this strange concept of thetans in our bodies and that kind of thing. So the actual teachings of Scientology could not be more different from Jehovah's Witnesses. But the way I describe it is, when it comes to cults, they may all look different on the outside. So you could have like a sports car and a pickup truck and an RV, but open up the hood and it's the same engine underneath. So you have the same systems of control. Anyone who criticizes our organization is bad. You mustn't listen to them. Anyone who does things that we don't approve of, especially if they're speaking against the leader, you should shun them, even if they're your family member. Just this very black and white way of looking at things. So I was delighted when Leah Remini approached me to help with the special on Jehovah's Witnesses, because I'd been watching her Aftermath series, thinking, well, this is exactly how things are done in Jehovah's Witnesses. It may be slightly different here and there, but for the most part, the policies and the way they treat people and the very kind of totalistic black and white view of the world that Scientology embraces, it's right out of the Jehovah's Witness copybook. So I was thrilled to help with her special.
Have you ever spoken to Leah Remini about like her? You say that she's still religious, like, but she asked you for help in looking into Scientology. Have you ever had a conversation with her on who's the position between her positions now? I mean, she's still religious, and that just strikes me as a little disingenuous on her part.
No, again, I view Leah in the same way as I would view any ex-Jehovah's Witness, going back to what I was saying earlier. You know, just because you get out of a cult doesn't mean, right, you know, where do I sign up for atheism? It just doesn't work that way, you know? So her family, before she got recruited into Scientology, was Catholic. And it makes sense to me. And by the way, when I first, you could say, woke up from my Jehovah's Witness beliefs, I didn't immediately say, right, point me in the direction of atheism. You know, I viewed myself for a while as, you could say, a doubting Christian. One of the last things that I stopped doing, my wife and I still chuckle at this, one of the last things I stopped doing was praying at McDonald's. After I left Jehovah's Witnesses, I'd still say a little prayer, you know, because I hated the idea of being ungrateful. And of course I don't do that anymore, but I'm highlighting that you don't just flick a switch from cult to atheism. I don't expect everyone to do that, and Leah hasn't done that. I don't think Mike's done that either, Mike Rinder. I'm just grateful that they are using their talents and their connections to highlight an area that no one's talking about. And even A&E, the network who did the Aftermath, after a while they couldn't take it, you know, and so Leah and Mike are trying to figure out new ways of putting out the content they want to make. But this is an area of the conversation that no one wants to touch. No one wants to be seen to be picking on the little guy. And Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses and lots of other groups still enjoy this status of, we're the little guy, please don't pick on us. So to push against that, I mean, you look at Leah, she could have just thought, right, I'm going to focus on my career as an actress. I'm going to focus on purely doing things that are anything to do with Scientology. And she's gone in completely the other direction. And I visited her at her home and I've said, you know, are you not at least tempted to just walk away from this? And she's looked me in the eye and she said, no way. I believe strongly in calling these organizations to account. So I've just got so much admiration for her, because when you think about working with Hollywood celebrities, you immediately think, well, there's the stereotype of the extremely shallow, self-obsessed people who talk the talk but aren't necessarily genuine about it. But she is 100% genuine, and she really does want to make a difference in this area.
One of the last things that I want to touch upon is the whole idea of covering up child abuse that you've seen. So this is a topic that is generally constrained to Catholicism after the Boston Globe found that 6% of all priests molested children. And so usually whenever anybody thinks of child molestation within a religion, the first one that they think of is the Catholic Church, and for good reason, I would say. But what's interesting about watching your videos is that this is apparently also a big problem within the Jehovah's Witness community. Why is that?
Oh, so many reasons. It's a very insular group. They believe that their first loyalty is to Jehovah and whatever they perceive Jehovah's will to be. And Caesar's law, or in other words, the authority of human governments, comes second to the need to follow, again, what they perceive to be God's will. So if you have a situation which exists where the organization says, well, if the scripture in Deuteronomy 19:15 isn't satisfied that there are two witnesses to something wrong happening, then we're going to treat it as though it hasn't happened. And they even apply that principle, which we call the two-witness rule, to child abuse. Now, you don't need me to tell you that when these monsters prey on children, they don't do it with an audience around to watch. You know, they do it without there being a second, third, fourth, or fifth witness, which is what's required and has been required for decades for witness elders to take abuse seriously. Without that second or third witness, elders are essentially told to act as though it hasn't happened, and that has directly informed the rate at which abuse is passed on to the authorities. And what we've found is, time after time, the authorities have been kept completely out of the loop. And what happens when you don't report abuse to the authorities, due to the very nature of what we know about pedophilia, is that more children end up being abused who needn't have been abused if the abuse was acted on to begin with. And that's essentially the problem that we have with Jehovah's Witnesses. Whereas with Catholicism, at least from my reading of the situation, it seems to be an issue in the priesthood and the way involving the way priests are moved around rather than handed over to the authorities, as should be happening. With Jehovah's Witnesses, it affects everyone. It affects all individuals in the organization. It's not just about the elders. It's not just about the ministerial servants. It's about all the lay members and whether or not they are reported. And the full horror of it all is that rather than reporting to the authorities, they are keeping this database of tens of thousands of names of perpetrators or accused perpetrators of abuse, and these records aren't being handed over to the authorities. I mean, if you think of any other organization outside the sphere of religion, we were talking about football earlier before we went on air. Imagine it was, I don't know, let's say a baseball team was keeping a database of known felons that it wasn't passing on to the authorities. It would be all over the news. But if it's a religion doing it, oh, well, you know, say no more, let's keep that under the rug. We don't want to bother with that. So that's the problem that, again, we're trying to highlight. It shouldn't be happening, but it is happening because we're living at the wrong point in history, and religion is still allowed to get away with way too much.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm so happy that people like you out there exist that are sort of, as you mentioned, religion seems to have this special privilege where if it were football, this would be all over the news. But because it's within the domain of God and religion, it's completely sheltered. And before we leave, I do want to plug your book, How to Escape from Jehovah's Witnesses, which I read on my train ride from university back to my own personal home. Yeah, you have it back there yourself.
There we go, yeah.
It is one of the most fascinating books I've ever read because it really just highlights how difficult it is for someone to escape something as seemingly benign as the Jehovah's Witness religion, which most people interpret it as. But it was crazy. And as I said, like I didn't grow up in the Jehovah's Witness religion. I had a babysitter who was a part of the religion, but I was never exposed to any of this sort of crazy stuff that actually happens there. So it's a fantastic book. I want everyone to absolutely get it just so they can at least get an idea of what it's like to be a part of a Jehovah's Witness and how it's like to try to escape it. And if there's anybody listening out there right now who is currently in the stage of doubting their religion, doubting the efficacy of their religion, do you have any tips that you could probably give them?
Oh, so if you're a Jehovah's Witness right now, maybe you stumbled on this video, do your research. And what I try and tell people in that situation is that research, objective research into your beliefs, in other words, listening to what the critics have to say, is a win-win scenario. Because if your beliefs are true, then you should be able to listen to the very worst arguments against them, and your faith will only be strengthened by the discovery that none of the arguments by people like me stack up. So you'll come away from this with rock-solid faith and nothing will ever affect you in the future. But if it happens that you are being lied to And of course, if Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult, there's bound to be people like me around explaining how it's a cult. Then of course you get to wake up from that and you get to take corrective measures. I will just also mention, if you don't mind, this is my second book, but this is my first book. I wrote this for people who are literally in the process of leaving, although I'm flattered that you still found it readable. This is more for the layperson, to explain to outsiders and those with a bit of a background what's going on in the organisation, and that's the Reluctant Apostate. So if you'll excuse the shameless plug for the first book.
Lloyd, if I can ask one further question. Listening to your interview with Seth Andrews, you mentioned that when you were introducing your new points of view to your father, he was already in the process of shunning you. Would you mind telling me, like, are you two back in any kind of contact whatsoever? I thought that was one of the most poignant parts of the interview. Just giving an example of how you can lose family and friends through separating yourself from religion. It's horrible.
Yeah, well, he was following orders, and that's the problem. You would think, I mean, I'm a father now, so if you were to tell me, oh well, one day you will want nothing to do with your daughters, Jessica and Julia, because they will have different ideas to you about religion, and you'll no longer want to speak to them, and you'll no longer want anything to do with their children. I'd say, don't speak total nonsense. Nothing will ever diminish the love I have for them. But what groups like Jehovah's Witnesses do is they erode people's humanity. And they say, well, never mind what feels right to you. You're going to do what we say is right. And so in my dad's case, I think to a degree it's further complicated by the fact that he's an elder. Because you could, in theory, not shun your disfellowshipped child, even though you're repeatedly told that you should, and you won't be disfellowshipped. It's only a disfellowshipping offence if you fail to shun someone who is not a relative. That's when you can be disfellowshipped yourself. If you fail to shun someone who is a relative, in other words, someone like me, in my dad's case, you are no longer, quote unquote, exemplary, and therefore you can't have certain privileges. And I wonder sometimes whether my father craves his position as an elder more than his relationship with me and with his two granddaughters and with my wife. But yeah, that is very much the case. And it was I write about it in The Reluctant Apostate, about when we had that exchange, and it made me extremely angry, and I reacted in a way that I'm not too proud of to this day. But nothing can really prepare you for your father or your mother looking at you in the eye and saying, I'm not going to have anything more to do with you if you continue on this course. So, yeah, that did happen.
Wow.
Yeah, it's awful to hear that. But I want to thank you endlessly for being able to come on the podcast, Lloyd. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
It's been my honor, and I hope to do it again and keep up the marvelous work. It's an important conversation you guys are having, and I'm delighted to add to it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I absolutely hope to have you back on, because you're definitely this is one of the best conversations that we've ever had, and it was just so enlightening and really inspirational to hear your story. So thanks for coming on, and we hope to see you again sometime in the future.
Thank you.
Take care, Lloyd.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking Out Loud. If you like the podcast, be sure to follow me on Twitter @LeydenPhysicist, as well as on Instagram @Pletson2019. I try to be as active as I can on there. Also, be sure to subscribe for more of this content. I'm going to be taking a break from these sorts of podcasts/interviews and focus more on solo videos for a bit. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.